Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shemeka Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. Thanks for joining us again. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-host Shemeka Michelle. Hopefully Will be joining us shortly. We have a tremendous guest this week. Our guest is Konstantin Kisin. He is a comedian and co-host of the wildly popular Trigonometry podcast. Konstantin, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
Well, hopefully if time permits, I want to get into some other things. I know when I reached out to you, I talked to you about comedy because that's so important, and I think it's in trouble, and a couple other things. But the main premise of the conversation, I wanted it to be that long and tremendous Twitter thread you posted about a week and a half ago. And I guess the subject was simply explaining why there's vaccine hesitancy for those who, if you're wondering why, let me explain why. But as we talk about it, I think it explains a lot more. And it was so great. I sent it to people, everybody I could think of, like, outside of the social media followers, just sending it to friends and my wife. And I say, you need to it's going to take you 10 minutes, but you must invest the time and read this whole thing. And everybody, just was kind of blown away by it. So I guess I want to start by talking about what made you just post that, because obviously you had to think long and hard about it and put that together. So, because as they say, you had the receipts with it. So what made you do it to begin with?
Well, I've been feeling for a long time that somebody needs to make it clear to people that just because you're slightly hesitant or really hesitant about taking the vaccine, which is an issue I feel very strongly about, I think it should be a free choice for people. If you're vulnerable, if you're elderly, I think in that situation, I personally would take the vaccine. But I think the push to encourage people who don't need it for their own protection, but in order to protect others, that's the first time in human history we've attempted to do this, to vaccinate people, therefore exposing them to some risk, as we would all acknowledge, in order to protect other people. I think doesn't make any sense. But of course, as you say, the thread that we're talking about, which then became an article, the point of that thread is to cover actually something much broader than just hesitancy about the vaccine. It's really about the decline of our institutions, the lack of trust in quote-unquote experts, and where that comes from. And I think I took it back to 5 years ago, prior to Brexit in my country and the election of Donald Trump in yours. We could go back further. Of course, there have been other things that have eroded trust, the invasion of Iraq under false pretenses, etc. But particularly in the last 5 years, I think we have seen every sort of expert, medical, scientific, journalistic, political, just reveal that they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. Their predictive power is close to zero. And to expect everybody to just trust them on faith after what they've exposed us to in the last 5 years, where they lied and lied and lied in order to get what they wanted. They abandoned all pretense of neutrality, all pretense of principle, and they've simply gone for the political benefit. And so if today green is good and blue is bad, and tomorrow it's the other way around, that's fine. They'll just go with that as long as it fulfills their political ambitions. And so to expect people to have faith in experts, to expect people to have faith in political analysts, to expect people to have faith in pollsters, to expect people to have faith in doctors who, for example, told us that we must all stay at home, we can't leave, there's a global pandemic, on which there is. But the moment that BLM happens and the riots are in the street, then the same doctors come out and tell us how actually protests are a quote, and I quote this from a timepiece, protests are a massive public health intervention, right? So yesterday, protesting, being outdoors was evil and wrong. Today, it's moral and good. If you keep messing with people's heads in this way, you can't be surprised that eventually they stop trusting you.
And that was all true. You had a mouthful there. And I think I look at it in a sense personally, it kind of in two ways, because you mentioned politics and obviously things have gotten ugly. I get in debates about issues, things I'm concerned about. How do we fix a problem? And everyone goes to politics. I'm like, it wasn't a political question. I want to know what you want for dinner. Well, if I'm a Democrat, I think I should have this. They go way too far. And you're right about that. But I also think that's only one half of it. So some of these people, those in power, are doing these to maintain their power, to see if we can get people to follow them, all these other issues. But there's a large segment of the population who are pushing this stuff as well, and they're going along with it. So you have to ask, are they doing it for political reasons, or are they doing it because they believe that, they have this blind trust in people, which could be a problem? Or do they have some other cultural kind of leanings that lead, like the people who virtue signal by saying, tattooing themselves with the vaccine, with a needle, or saying, I don't want to wear a mask. I think I trust the vaccine and I'm vaccinated. But if I don't wear a mask, how will you know I'm not a Trump supporter, right? So a lot of this has been psychological stuff. It rolls beyond the political, don't you think? So what do you think about that?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying, but I would add one piece which I think is missing in that analysis, which is technology. And the technological shifts that have happened in the last 10 years have been so profound, and they've changed our societies and our brains to such an extent that I think we don't really understand the impact yet. But one of the consequences that you are now seeing is exactly what you're talking about, which is everything is political, and I've always said politics ruins everything. And so if everything is political and politics ruins everything, that's kind of how you get to the position we're in, because it's hacked and hijacked the circuits in our brains that have always been there. The need to signal virtue, as you say, the need to look virtuous to other people, to look good, to be seen to be doing and saying the right thing, I think has hijacked a lot of people's neurocircuitry. And so people feel like they have to be doing certain things in order to communicate things to the outside world in a way that they never were able to, because they didn't have a tool that allowed them to communicate with thousands and millions of people at the click of a button. So I think the technology is a very big part of this as well.
So, Shemeka, can you talk about what you thought when you first saw his thread, and obviously anything that stood out to you?
First of all, I want to say I appreciated it, because when it comes to the vaccine, I think I've just been thinking about the Tuskegee experiment, or how they sterilized Black women. And, a lot of people are saying, oh, that's in the past, but you brought the lies current. And so that's what I really appreciated about it, because I was like, yes, they lied about this just this year, just a few months ago, and so it was current for me that they are still lying. They still don't know what they're talking about. They don't know. Just this week, I watched them go from, we're going to have a third dose for those who are immune compromised, to now the third dose is for everybody, and I'm just like, just earlier this week, it was only for a small group of people. Now everybody's, antibodies are down, and they're going to need this shot come September. And I'm like, wow, they are changing so fast. They don't know what they're talking about. And so I appreciated the thread, just bringing everything current to show that, no, this wasn't just, years ago. It's right now.
Right.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And I should also explain that my thread about why people are vaccine hesitant wasn't intended to promote vaccine hesitancy per se. I think, as I said, people should be able to make their own choice about this issue. And I know friends who've messaged me after reading it saying, actually, it's made me far more likely to take the vaccine, because while I appreciate that there's a very good reason not to trust the government, actually, I also realized that my mistrust was not necessarily based on a lack of faith in the vaccine itself. Do you see what I'm saying? So I think it's just helped a lot of people clarify their thinking. I'm glad it has.
Right. I think the problem, like the point was vaccine hesitancy, and Shemeka mentioned some concerns, and people have different concerns, and I don't necessarily hold all of those same concerns, like you said. But she said something interesting. She said that when she brings up her concerns, whether people think they're valid or not, some of the responses she gets is, right, well, that's in the past. That is flat out laughable, because most of what's going on in America, and you get it a bit there, but not to the extent, fortunately, it's all about the past. Johnny can't read because of the past. they're shooting in neighborhoods because of the past. We need reparations to correct, say it along with me, men and women, the past. So it's all about the past. But then when you say, well, in the past, they did some shady stuff. Well, that's just in the past. It goes to the political thing where everything's selective. And so I want to get Will in here shortly, but I do want to ask you, we know they were wrong. What percentage of this was them making mistakes and just CYA? We don't want to admit we make mistakes, and just flat out lies. Like, I knew it wasn't true when I said it. I'm going to say it. And definitely, if I didn't know it when I said it, I knew it when I repeated it. So how much of this do you think is deliberate, Konstantin?
It's hard to know, isn't it? And it's also hard to know what is and isn't really influential or deliberately or not. For example, look at something like polling, right? You might go, well, the pollsters keep getting elections wrong. Well, it's a difficult thing to do. They didn't quite take into account certain demographics. Why did that happen? All right. Well, look, at the end of the day, the election is the election. It happened, and that's what happened. But of course, this isn't true at all, because polling in advance of elections influences people's voting behavior, right? So if you continually put out polls which underestimate one particular side of the political spectrum, then what you are doing is voter suppression. That is so, and if that is a consistent pattern, whether it's deliberate or not, it's going to continually affect the democratic process. And everywhere you look, as I detailed in the thread, there is consistent patterns of behavior which show that there are things that are influencing our choices, our voting preferences, etc., which are either lies or, as you say, are deliberate. Now, I obviously can't give you an overarching, play-by-play analysis of every single thing that's happened in the last 5 years and say this was deliberate and this wasn't. But I would point maybe to just one or two bits that I thought were absolutely clearly deliberate and intentional, and there's no ambiguity about them at all. That were major pieces, major events that we've never really seen in the way that we saw. So the one that did it for me, and I remember I'm sitting in our studio now where my colleagues, we hang out, we live here, etc. And we woke up and I saw that the New York Post had printed a story about Hunter Biden. This was a couple of weeks before the election in America. And that Twitter, Facebook, other big tech companies essentially prevented that story from being shared. They prevented it from being seen. They prevented it from being retweeted. They prevented it from being sent via DMs, etc. And that's when I said, well, democracy's over, right? Because if a big tech company can prevent relevant pieces of information from being published that would influence an election, and I'm not saying this as a partisan, by the way. I'm not on the right, I'm not on the left. I'm very much kind of ambivalent about different things. I have right of center views, I have left of center views, but I'm just observing and I'm trying to call it as it is, right? So if a big tech company can prevent a crucial piece of information from being published that would definitely influence the election. And we saw polling after the election which showed that many Democrats, had they known about the Hunter Biden story, they would not have voted for Joe Biden. That is election interference, deliberate election interference. Of course, you follow that up with the situation we have now where Donald Trump is banned from Twitter, but the Taliban spokesman is on it. It's clown world. And that was absolutely deliberate. And to me, what you saw in the banning of Donald Trump from Twitter, in the ending of Parler as a business, and the suppression of the Hunter Biden story, which later, of course, turned out to be true, as we now know, that to me was essentially the big tech, these hoodie-wearing billionaires realizing the power that they have to influence the democratic process. And I am not sure if this is allowed to continue, whether we will ever have a free or fair election anywhere in the world ever again.
Well, I want to go to Will, but I want to say something to that point. What you just said, that was so brilliant, and I want people to focus in on it. And watching your podcast is the way you approach the interviews, which is so good. It's not that you are mostly centrist and you're just trying to get down to the bottom of the whatever the topic is. It's that whether intentional or not, you have a way of explaining in some, if the issue is some things that you're kind of opposite of what the main culture, but the mainstream media and what the hard left is pushing for. But you kind of use their arguments just as clearly as they do the other way. I talked about one earlier, but you just did it there saying, well, I don't really know what level was intentional or not. I can't say, I'm not there, but I do know that if we know that these things, and we have the data and the polling for the people who said they would have changed their mind, we know what the effects were regardless of the intent, then we know it had an impact. Well, they often say that it doesn't matter if you're, the anti-racists say it doesn't matter if you intend to be racist. You have this implicit bias and your actions cause this. So it's almost like you're saying, well, if that's the case, then these actions cause this. So why aren't you equally upset about the negative reaction and the negative outcome of these actions? And you're picking and choosing which bad thing is really bad and which one isn't. So I just think that's great, and kudos to you.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for saying. I have to say, I don't take much praise out of that, because pointing out the logical inconsistencies in some of these people are saying is not that hard at all.
But it's how you do it, because some people do it in a way that's antagonistic and in your face, and all the people they get upset because they're like, I just hear this name calling. I just think you're calling me out, or you're only singling out these people. When you just say, you just make a really clear point and you just sit back and watch them struggle to kind of debate their way out of this wet paper bag, kind of speak. But Will, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I read the entire so first of all, before even getting into my take on the thread, which will be pretty quick, we saw another example of this today, kind of tech bro control of speech, or yesterday, when OnlyFans decided to ban all porn because the payment processing companies didn't trust it, essentially. They said they didn't want to work with what was identified as a porn platform, and they demanded these things like age and identity verification of every person in every video, obviously just attempting to block what OF is. It's a platform for college-age sex workers. So OnlyFans went along with this, and today, if you log on to Twitter or Instagram, I mean, there are people absolutely panicking, wondering what they're going to do. Whatever you think about the morality of porn, the reality is, again, that 4 or 5 of what Konstantin described as hoodie-wearing billionaires just decided to do this, and an entire ecosystem ended. And it's remarkably easy to make that happen. That should be troubling for everyone. We saw this first with the alt-right boys and with a few actual communists, where it became very difficult for people to take taxi cabs or get on planes. And I think the reaction from most in kind of that center-right space was, oh, well, both of those groups are the enemy, who cares? But the precedent had been set. And so next, quote-unquote, they came for the sex workers. The reality is they could do this to anyone. I mean, when you look at trigonometry or cut the bull, any sort of edgy media piece, what if you, quote-unquote, misgender someone once? Does the entire platform come down a substantial source of income? The reality is that could happen. Everyone should be aware of that. As for the thread itself, I mean, I think that it's pretty obvious why it had such an impact. What's being referred to is what the OG Tom Sowell once called the vision of the anointed, which is kind of the idea that a few smart people, those that went to the right colleges and live in the 3 or 4 acceptable cities, they're 99.4% white, but you're not supposed to notice, all upper class, good looking, high G, so on. These are the people that have a duty to determine reality for the plebs. You can't trust them. So yeah, I mean, prior to the Donald Trump election, every newspaper in the country with a circulation of more than 50,000, as I recall, endorsed his opponent and ran articles about how he couldn't win. And then you saw, as sophisticated polling had indicated for quite a while, that in fact he won. Same thing with Brexit, same thing with Johnson, so on down the line. So when these same people are telling you, look, the experts, your bosses, are saying you need to go out and get this vaccine, there's almost no risk, so on. A lot of people in the US, the UK, the other free societies are going to say, excuse me, but that sounds like bullshit. You know, you've been saying this for years. You've been saying this about the Iraq War, to flip to the right, which killed a number of my friends. You've been saying this about the last couple of elections, so on down the line. And to some extent, I'm vaccinated, I'm glad of it, but the skeptics were correct. I mean, the major arguments that the vaccines wouldn't work as well as advertised, that we'd be asked to mask after vaccination, I mean, that there would be breakthrough infections if you get vaccinated, that Big Pharma is going to demand a 3rd or a 4th follow-up vaccine. These things all turned out to be wholly true. As an executive in the state of Kentucky, I mean, we're being I mean, it's basically being said that you should expect to get that update. So pretty soon, last line from me, you're going to see people with 3 or 4 shots criticizing people who've just gotten 2 shots as the unvaccinated. It's never going to stop. I mean, when people stopped saying, let's say, the N word or cracker, which I guess I should describe as the C word or something like that, when that really became taboo, even in athletics and so on, I think for a couple of years, everyone assumed, okay, we cleaned up speech. But then the next wave of it began. You're not supposed to say retarded or fat or whatever. So it's never going to stop unless people just say, I'm going to make my own logical decisions. Sure, I respect an expert, but you know who else is an expert? My physician. People are going to embrace the capacity for logical thought, which is not a discipline-specific skill. I'm not surprised there's doubt.
Right. And one last piece of the doubt on the vaccination thing is, like I said earlier, I don't agree with all of the arguments against it. Like Will just pointed out, some of the things they said was true. Some of them were true. But a weird thing to me was when people would say, like some of the people who were skeptical of taking the vaccine would say, well, it's new and I want to know what the side effects are. And some people would say it was safe. That's, whatever. But some would say, well, you're raising these concerns, and it's totally safe. There's no health risks. But of course, that person's going to say, but I'm a little confused. It's a medication and everything has a health risk. I mean, an aspirin has a health risk in certain situations. So just be honest about it if you're trying to convince people to take it, and don't say, shut up, there's no side effect at all and take it, because you're just making, whether you're right or wrong about it's generally safe, you're driving people down because you're making them more skeptical, because they're like, okay, now I know you're lying because you just tried to tell me a medicine can't make me sick at all, regardless of what, because while literally we can look up the research and see that they're telling certain people with certain conditions not to take it. I know at least 3 people that the doctor said, well, because of this, you can't take it. So then don't turn around and say it's safe for everyone. Just explain it in a way that people will get it. And I mean, not everybody, but you will get a higher percentage of people that take it.
Well, it's interesting that both of you seem to be honing in on a similar point, which is if the anointed were honest with the public, then you might have a better reaction from the public. But of course, that isn't how the anointed view the public. The anointed view ordinary people as stupid, ignorant, probably deeply suspicious, morally reprehensible, definitely racist, definitely xenophobic, definitely sexist, definitely trans. I mean, you go down the list. That is how they view the public. And so if you're talking to someone who you despise, you look down upon, you think they're an idiot, then you're not going to trust them with the truth. You're going to instead massage reality into something that's absolutist, because you're not interested in persuading people. You're interested in forcing them to do what you want. But I thought Will made some really good points there. And I actually wanted to throw out a question to you guys, because one of the things he was talking about is the mission creep. The language perpetually becomes more and more constrained, and there's new words that you can't say, and before it was colored, now it's people of color, then that, in the UK it was BAME, and now that's racist, and it never ends, and it always gets more complicated. I wanted to ask you guys, do you know where the term political correctness comes from?
I don't remember. I was just talking to someone about that too, but I don't remember.
Right.
No, I don't remember.
Well, the reason I ask is because, as you know, I'm from Russia, and the political correctness was actually something that was first used in the Soviet Union during the Communist Revolution, and then taken on by Maoists in China. And the reason the term is political correctness is that in the Soviet Union, if you said something that was factually true, but was inconvenient to the party line, they would say to you, well, comrade, this is factually correct, but it's politically incorrect. Right? So the purpose of political correctness has always been about one thing and one thing only, which is to enshrine and protect the party line, the dogma that the anointed, as Thomas Sowell describes them, that want you to believe. Political correctness has never been about protecting people's feelings. It's never been about preventing offense. It's never been about any of that. Political correctness has always had one purpose and one purpose only: to advance and protect the party line. And that's why none of this will ever change, because they will keep going and going. They will keep finding new things to fight about. And of course, the other part of this, and I'm writing about this, I know you've got a book coming out, Charles, which I'm really looking forward to reading. I'm working on a book at the moment as well, called An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. And one of the bits that I cover is what's happened to language in my lifetime in the West, last 10, 15, 20 years. And if you look at almost any word now that is a kind of hot button issue word that we talk about, they've almost all of them got the opposite meaning to the one that they started with. So if you look at, take the word diversity, for example, right? Diversity, if you look in a dictionary, means difference and variety, right? But of course, when we talk about diversity now, we don't mean that at all. Yes, sure, we mean superficially people have different skin colors, but this conversation with us, it might be considered diverse because you've got people from different backgrounds or whatever. But if we all had the same opinion, that would still be considered diverse, right? Right. So how diverse is that? Or if you had four people from the same background, with exactly the same opinion, that isn't diversity, unless of course they're all black, in which case that is diversity, right? So you take the same people, you swap their skin colors, and you've gone from being diverse to not being diverse, and vice versa. Look at the term safety, right? What does safety mean? Well, safety means, normally, if you look in a dictionary, it means the absence of violence, right? That's what it means. What have we changed the meaning to? The meaning of safety is now the opposite of that, which is safety is the absence of words that you don't like. And a safe space is one from which you can be excluded. An inclusive space is one from which you can be excluded for having the wrong opinion. And on and on and on we go. So my point is, political correctness, and the reason that the thing that Will is talking about is the changing of language is happening, it's because there's a party line that we're all supposed to toe, that we're all supposed to stick to, and if you don't comply with it, then you're being politically incorrect, and that means you will be expelled from the party, that you must be expelled from the tribe, from the anointed. You can never be part of civilized society. That is why all of this is happening, in my view.
So, Shemeka, what are some of the points from the thread that took you back, that you remember, you can say to you, that stood out to me at the time, or that was a turning point for me, or some of the ones that you think are the cleanest lines from that you could draw to vaccine hesitancy or anything else?
I don't know about drawing it directly to vaccine hesitancy, but just thinking about how the media has lied, it brought me back to when I went to my first Trump rally. I think it was 2019, I guess, and it was really hot outside. It was in Fayetteville, North Carolina. We were out there for a very long time. This was before I had kind of, moved up the ranks to get VIP tickets. And so we were standing out there for a really long, once we got in, everyone was drenched, because they were either sweating so bad or, pouring water on their heads to stay cool. There were women in the bathroom trying to dry their hair with the hand dryers. And I remember Trump coming out and he, was talking about how people were, drenched waiting to get inside. And the news ran with that and started calling him a liar, saying, we checked the forecast. There was no rain in Fayetteville. This man is such a liar. And I was just literally blown away, like, oh my God, he never said that it rained. He just said people were drenched waiting outside, and they were. Like, I saw this with my own eyes, and I just saw the media turn it into something that it wasn't. And I remember I had taken my best friend with me who wasn't in politics, and she saw that herself, and it really changed her to be like, oh my God, the media is actually just running with the story that's not true. And so just reading the thread took me back to that point, because I think that was an eye-opener for me that, oh my God, the media will just blatantly lie, and they can't be trusted.
It's such an interesting point you make, Shemeka. And just coming back to the point I was talking about earlier, you talking about going to a Trump rally reminded me of this. When I talk about the changing definitions of words, look at even the word black, right? If you went to a Trump rally, I'm assuming therefore that you voted Trump, therefore you quote unquote ain't black. right?
Right.
So they're changing the meaning of everything now. But I totally hear you. And for me, that experience, I'm from Russia. I have a lot of family in Ukraine. My wife is Ukrainian. So when I saw, if you remember in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine, annexed the peninsula called Crimea in the south of Ukraine, invaded eastern Ukraine and took over that part with sort of supposedly local rebels, which were just Russian soldiers in disguise. But the media in the West covered it as like, well, we've got to respect this, and we got like there's a balance to everything, right? Like there is no objective truth. Like if you've got a rapist and a rape victim, their stories are equally valid, and they've both got to be heard in the same way, which of course is complete nonsense, right? There is a truth. Either something happened or it didn't, and you have to go in and find out. But your point about, I think, the coverage of Trump. Look, my own view was Trump told a hell of a lot of lies. I don't know if he ever lied about the rain. I imagine he didn't. I did think he was dishonest on many occasions, as many politicians are, by the way. But I think he did take it to a particularly extreme level. But the point is that at the same time, he was also the most lied about president as well, right? So that was the difficulty. And I think the problem that we saw with the media is, rather than just reporting honestly, which I think would have been enough, what they did instead is essentially just become a propaganda outlet of the Democratic Party. And I think a lot of people who were fair-minded and who were quite happy to take the truth in about a character as complex as Donald Trump, right? Nobody, I think, would, even in our conversation here, pretend that this guy was uniquely and universally good with no downsides, right? Everybody's got a shadow and everybody's got problems with what they do. But what they did with Donald Trump is they just pretended that this guy was not just Hitler, he was worse than Hitler. He was something uniquely evil. And I think that lost the trust of a lot of people. And then you compound that with all the other things that we've talked about and I detailed in the thread. And you end up in a position where you kind of, I call it the boy who cried racism. Like, you can only say the same thing so many times before people are just going to tune you out completely.
Right. Well, I don't talk Trump that much. Well, now, because he's not in office, and what's the point? And before, I was like, it's a weird circular conversation, because either people are going to defend him no matter whether they're going to attack him. But I'm like you. I sat back and I looked at this, and I just thought it was fascinating what was happening. So I had evolved as watching this, and I was like, Trump's just a guy to me. I'm not a fan of politicians, by just normally. So, whatever. And I don't know if he lied more. I agree that he lied, but how much it was, it's kind of hard to say, because some of it is lying because politicians lie. His lies fell into three categories: normal political lies. Some of it was like he loved to exaggerate the truth. So sometimes people say he lied. I was like, of course it wasn't true, but it's like puffery. You knew it wasn't true. It's like a used car salesman. He didn't really mean it. So are we really going to hang evil lie on this, right? And some of it, which I would say is definitely a negative, but some of it I put in the category of, he's thin-skinned in a sense. So like, he got attacked. So this is his way of attacking back. Doesn't make it right, but I put it in a framework. So I look at this, and then you'd have interesting conversations with Shemeka, I'm sure, because she moved up, like she talked about, to her VIP status. She was part of the walk away movement. So, they got to see a lot of things in the front row. So, right up front, she can see what was happening. And like you probably just saw the news and saw the spin. So we weren't there, but we can use our logic. But I found myself, and people would call me a Trump supporter, whatever. I'm like, what? I don't support any politician. But I kind of saw why, but I looked at it like, it's your fault, not mine. Because I found myself defending him a bit in conversations, and I had to point out that this is not a defense of Trump. It's a defense of truth. What you're saying is a flat out lie. And you just made a great point, Konstantin. You said that if they would have just covered him fairly. My point was, if he's so bad, now obviously he has flaws, but if he's so bad, if he's worse than Hitler, why do you have to fabricate anything, right? The evils that he does should be so clear and should be enough to bury him. So one of my biggest ones was I almost said Covington, but no, it was the Charlottesville.
Right.
I don't like politicians because either they're like Obama and they're too slick, or they're like Bush and Trump and they're kind of clunky. So, but I like politics and history. So I read transcripts. So it's a whole different thing. So somebody speaks, no, I didn't listen, I read transcript. So I'm reading the transcript. So when the news broke, I had read the transcript. And of course, when you read it, you just get words, right? And I'm like, He literally said, no, he said, I'm not talking about them. And then somebody asked him, so are you talking about them? No, I am not talking about them. Are you sure? No, I'm not. And then all the news to this day, Joe Biden ran saying, I had to run for president because this guy said Nazis are great.
Right.
I mean, so that for me was just like, it's not a defense of him. I can't get into his intent. What I do know is we have straight media people. The Evening Desk, the Tom Brokaws, the Dan Rathers of the world are now flat out lying to us and then just saying, I'm going to say it with a straight face. And if you don't believe it, there's something wrong with you. And of course, people are going to believe it. So I thought that was a problem. And during his whole presidency, I thought they laid it up before they even got to lying. They just laid it on so thick. Even when he did make a mistake, it was instead of saying he said this and that's not true, it's this. On to whatever it was. This is the most monumental lie I've ever been told. Has there ever? So I found it interesting that they were tracking Trump's lies. We can debate whether the numbers were right, but somehow the presidential lie tracking stopped when he wasn't president anymore.
Right.
Since we started this new thing, can we just track Biden? I'm just saying, can we just keep it going? It was a great idea. Can we keep it going? Nah, we don't need it anymore. Lies no longer exist. Political lies no longer exist.
And it's interesting as well that you mentioned that because I don't know if you've seen in recent days with the pullout from Afghanistan, which has obviously been a disaster. Joe Biden was interviewed by George Stephanopoulos. Right. And he reacted with this visceral anger when he was asked about his decision. And I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm certainly not his psychiatrist, but I can't help but think that a lot of that visceral anger comes from the fact that he's not used to being questioned by the media in this way in the last couple of years. They've let him have an easy run. And so when they do actually start challenging him, he's like, wait, I'm a Democrat. What are you doing? Right? It feels kind of like that to me, But I actually, going back to what Shemeka said, which I thought was very important as well, is I think there's another piece to why this anger happened over the last 5 years. And I think part of it was actually the fact that these so-called anointed people in the media, etc., they were very frustrated that they no longer controlled the levers of power when it came to information. Suddenly people can go on a podcast and have a conversation and you can't tell people what to think anymore. And you actually have to present data and be persuasive. You can't be lazy. You can't just write an article or whatever nonsense and BS that you want and expect people to just buy it because they don't have any alternative, because there's only 3 TV channels and 5 newspapers, and that's what you're going to get. So I think a lot of that rage that we saw over the last 5 years, was actually a product of the fact that they know the game is up. And it's interesting because every time, and this is not the first viral thread I've had about essentially the decline in our trust in the media, every time the reaction from journalists is not to refute it, is not to explain why I'm wrong, it's not to address the points that I've made, it's always this visceral anger. And it's like children. This is how the level of response is so childish. It just makes me think, I think, deep down, they know the game is up and they're absolutely terrified. And I'm delighted about that.
Well, that's a good point, because one thing I want to say, because I do want to get to a couple other things, but this is so important. Shemeka talked about the media, and you talked about lies earlier, and I asked you earlier what percentage of the stuff that you mentioned in your tweet were deliberate, and you said you don't know, obviously. But, let's do a little forensic investigation here. Some of these things you have to assume, at least I certainly do, can't speak for you, but I have to assume, whether they're lying or not, I don't know, but that they don't even believe the things that they're saying. Right? Because so to those, I mean, we shouldn't assume. I kind of assume, because everybody in the world didn't read your tweet, but I would assume people who follow us did. So they kind of know what we're talking about. But you pointed out some things like you mentioned earlier, Hillary was going to win, the Russian collusion, because we didn't mention that, the Covington kids, masks, wear masks, don't wear a mask, they don't help, they do help, gender fluidity, riots, when is a pandemic bad, or when is it okay to be in crowds, and hate crimes. So, the reason I say, do they mean this? You could do a whole thread of examples. I'm kind of pitching your next thread here about, do they mean what they say? So Don Lemon got on CNN and said the most dangerous domestic terrorist is a white man, but he goes home to a white man.
Right.
Right. It seems like the gay black man with the white man is the most common person to say that all white people are racist. Right. Then they said that, like the polling thing. They keep getting polls wrong, but we all know that people who do these polls make a lot of money doing it. So being wrong once is one thing, but being wrong and being very wrong, like saying somebody has a 99% chance of winning and they win, but it's close, you're still wrong. But, but to lose with that level of accuracy and being wrong, but that still works. The same pollers are still doing polls. They did the poll in the next election. They did the 2020 polls. They will do the 22 polls. So you have to wonder if all of this stuff, if nothing's really changing, the same players are in the move, the same things are being done, they react the same way. You talked about, I'm trying to remember the parallel I wanted to use, like something happened in the way they report it. But I think that the way they report the Taliban in Afghanistan is going to be the same way, right? It's going to be, a little bit of pressure, so it looks like we're doing media, but Trump was worth, raise the Trump flag, step back and say, well, we got to commend this. I think it was MSNBC. I don't know if you two saw the clip. They're showing his press conference live. Afterwards, Brian Williams is talking to someone and he's talking to him. So he's analyzing. He said, I think that was a powerful speech. He owned it. He did a great job. And the guy's like, dude, I don't know if you saw the same speech I saw, but what are you talking about? And Brian Williams is like, well, I don't know if you could say that. I'm Brian Williams. I was there. It's fascinating. So they still, as long as as the masses listen to them and give them a bit of credibility, it's crumbling. But as long as that happens, they're able to say things that they know is not true, that they know they don't believe. I'm afraid climate change, I'm not saying it's not true, but we're going to be dead in 5 years and all of the water is going to rise. So my solution is to buy a $20 million home right on the water. Konstantin.
Right. Well, I agree with you, man. And look at you look at any aspect of the people who are advocating for communism, then they're not getting on rafts and sailing to Cuba, right?
Buying homes.
They are staying happily in America, or the kind of racial activists who say that white people are the greatest peril on earth, and being around them, it makes them insane. They're not emigrating to Africa. Right? Why is that? Well,
they're also not moving into the black community. I mean, when LeBron and who's the woman from Scandal? She came out and said, what's her name? Kerry Washington about a year ago said, I'm afraid for my kids to play in the front yard because I'm afraid some white person will see them outside and call the police. But mother cub, you care about your kids, you do whatever you can to protect them. Don't you put your house for sale up tomorrow and move to a black neighborhood there?
Well, yeah, she's not moving to the hood in Chicago because she knows that there's a lot bigger problems there than a white person calling the police, right?
Right.
So yeah, these people, I don't know whether they genuinely don't believe the things they're saying. I think the problem with those sections of what you might describe as the far left, or whatever the word is, the woke, whatever your language you want to choose, they have an extraordinary ability, and I'm kind of jealous of it because having principles is painful often. They have an extraordinary ability to hold two completely contradictory things in the head at the same time and believe them both at once. Right. So to hold them in your head at once is a very powerful skill, and it's very important to be able to consider two different opposing ideas and consider which one of them may be more true or less true. But to believe two completely contradictory ideas at the same time is crazy, and they've got it, man. They're brilliant at it. I mean, look at Afghanistan, which is what we're talking about now. All of these liberal Western feminists have been telling us that the burqa is in fact a sign of women's liberation and diversity and all the other buzzwords that they use. But when the Taliban come in and actually make women wear the burqa, no, that's really bad and wrong. So you can't have those two beliefs at the same time, but somehow they've managed to reconcile it. So in many ways, I'm extremely envious and jealous of them for these magic tricks that they have in their locker.
Oh, yeah, no, you're not wrong. They're absolutely brilliant. One I liked was they said, well, we talked to the Taliban and they said they will ensure women rights.
Right.
Oh,
right.
Yeah,
and I tweeted something the other day that it reminded me of William Dodd, who was our first ambassador to Germany right when Hitler was coming into power, right? And I think Eric Larson wrote a book, In the Garden of Beasts. So how he noticed something is like he thinks everything's fine, and I read the book, so there's parts of it where it looks like normal, right? People are friendly, people are bustling about, and the daughter's walking around, but then he walks down an alley. It's like a movie. You look down the alley and you see this train, and they're just putting Jews in the train. Like, don't pay attention to this. So at night they were doing all this stuff. And then I went to, one of the concentration camps, and I was watching one of the propaganda films they would show, and they would show these people, they would make them act out, right? They would have these young Jewish kids playing games. They would have the adults throwing the ball. It was all fun. And then they turn off the cameras and do what really happened. So it was to kind of keep the West like, no, we're not doing anything bad. Come and look at what we're doing. And that's what I see here. So the Taliban is like, no, we're going to have, open conversations. Don't run away if you were against us. We're going to be friendly to everybody. And then at night, they're knocking on doors looking for people. But we know it's happening, and the media is kind of like torn about how they want to cover it as opposed to just covering it. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and when they say they're going to do it in the confines of Sharia law, like I remember my daughter doing a paper or project on Sharia law, and I'm like, but that doesn't sound that good to me, and it's just like, I can't believe the media is actually, putting this out as if it's going to be a good thing. Right.
It's like, they're really good at selling it them. So really quickly, the last thing about the thread is reactions. I want to talk about the reactions. I tried to read some, but of course, you get so many replies and so many likes that there's a lot of them, but I kind of scanned through them and they were fascinating. Obviously, I still think the majority of the people agree with you, but some of the people were, they weren't happy. Right. So even though to the people who haven't seen it, we'll put it when I post this, I will post the link to it because you would talk about a story, link the article, talk about a story so they could just go and read it. But people are still like, well, that's not the same. And Trump did stab 6 people. I mean, just way off on the rails. So how much of that? You probably read more of them than I did. So what was the overall reaction?
Yeah, look, I think, I've been part of other viral events in the past. And so one of the things I've learned about human brains, particularly my own, and I think it's true of most people, is we perceive negative reactions as far more numerous, far more significant than positive ones. So 1,000 people liking or retweeting something or saying well done doesn't feel quite as good as, or doesn't feel quite significant rather, as one person who says you're an idiot or you're completely wrong. So it's hard to be able to judge this. Obviously with the thread, it's something that got a lot of attention. A lot of people were very positive. And there's something I learned from my parents at a very, very young age, was that you can only really, or you should only, in my opinion, concern yourself with the opinion of people that you respect, right? The opinions of people you don't respect, well, if some guy walks up to you in the street and calls you an idiot, are you going to take that seriously and go, oh, maybe I should get an IQ test, actually, maybe I am really stupid? Like, that's not going to influence how you feel about yourself, right? Or you shouldn't, at least. So it shouldn't. So, and then that's always been my attitude with social media. If you're someone whose opinion I value or respect, or ought to, because I believe that you are someone like that, then I'll take it seriously and I'll analyze it. And my experience of those people was that the feedback was almost uniformly positive. Of course, people quibbled with elements of it, as they always would. I certainly wouldn't claim that everything I said was entirely true, or the logical connections between everything I said were entirely accurate. I was just pitching my vision of what I've seen over the last 5 years and welcoming people to come in and go, well, actually, maybe you can think about this in a different way or whatever. That's the way I always try and put my ideas out there. Of course, as I said, journalists in particular, if you take the kind of the usual Twitter pond life out of the conversation, the people who are below the fold or whatever you call it, where it's just abuse and harassment or whatever, the journalists took it very badly, and I deduce from that and from their lack of counter argument that they felt that it was true and were deeply scared and discombobulated.
They were embarrassed by it because a lot of it was based on their work.
Right, I'm calling them out and I'm saying they've been lying, and I'm saying the reason no one trusts them and that people have almost as bad an opinion of journalists as they do of politicians, which is an achievement if you think about it.
It's almost zero.
Right? Yeah, that's an incredible achievement to get to that point.
That low.
There's a reason for that, and the reason isn't that the public are stupid or bigoted or racist or whatever. It's that you keep lying to them and they don't like it. Right. And I think a lot of them took it badly. But I think it was the article did very well, which was based on the thread and the thread itself. So yeah, I think it resonated with a lot of people.
Well, we just have a few minutes here. I'm looking behind you and I'm looking at good old Joseph Stalin and a sign that says cancel culture myth. Didn't know that was going to be there when I sent you this. But I want to talk briefly about the Pew Research where it says majority hadn't heard of cancel culture. And I think this is a pro and a con. I want to hear what both of you think about this. I think it's bad because people like us who are trying to impose common sense and get people to critical think, not tell them what to do, just say, think about things. It's like, man, we're not reaching as many people as we do. We feel bad, right? It's all glass half full, glass half empty. Because it also means that the anti-racist, woke, far left, crazy control freaks aren't reaching as many people as they think, right? What do you think about that poll? Either of you.
Well, look, if Shemeka, did you want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
All right, thank you. So what I was going to say is, I think from my perspective, the whether people are familiar with a particular language is much less interesting to me than whether they are aware of the phenomenon. And I think there's a big difference between those two things. So I mentioned having been involved in other viral events in the past. What happened with me at the very end of 2018 is, as a comedian, I was asked to perform at a college gig. And when they invited me, they sent me a zero tolerance policy, which said that they have a zero tolerance on racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-religion, anti-atheism. And it also said that all jokes must be respectful and kind, right? Now, just to put it in context, at the time, I wasn't someone who was well known at all. I didn't have a big social media following or anything like that. I wasn't a huge name on the comedy circuit. I was doing all right, but I wasn't a huge name. The college that it happened at wasn't a big college. The gig was a charity gig that was unpaid. It wasn't a big deal, really.
Wow.
But the story went super viral in the UK. It went viral around the world. This, just to give you the sense of how viral it went, it was the second most read article on the BBC News website, which is the #1 news website in the UK, on the day that the Prime Minister of our country, Theresa May, was nearly removed from office by her own party. So this is the equivalent of Donald Trump 2 years ago nearly being impeached by the Republican Party, and a story about some no-name comedian is the second most read one on the main publication site in the country, right? Now, is that because ordinary British people and people around the world from almost every country in the world, I got messages from places in Africa, right, about this. Did people really care about comedian being restricted and what he could joke about? No. The reason people cared about that is that they felt in their own lives on a day-to-day basis like we're all walking around as if we've signed some stupid zero tolerance contract. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of public opinion. It'll be used against you in your employment. It'll be used against you at your school. It'll be used against you at university. Wherever you are, you've signed a contract. And if you say the wrong thing, you're going to suffer the consequences, right?
Even if you did it 30 years ago.
Correct. And so I think the fact that people are or are not familiar with the term cancel culture is less relevant to me. What interests me much more is how many people feel that they are unable to express their political or other views. And
that wasn't high enough.
Right. Well, and if you look at that research, actually, there have been some other polls done about this. Almost 80% of the public in America feel like they can't say what they think, and very similar numbers in the UK. So while people may or may not be familiar with the term cancel culture per se, actually, I think awareness of the climate and the corrosive environment that we operate in is very widespread. And I think that's a good thing insofar as it means that there will be some pushback against it.
Maybe it's getting like the CRT debate. We don't care what the title is. We don't like or we do like what's going on behind it.
Right.
Right.
Did you want to add something quickly? Shemeka, I wanted to ask him one more question, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's my concern, that people actually understand what it is. I don't care what they call it, but I also want to make sure that people know that it's a big deal, because I've seen a lot of people, I got kicked off Facebook in 2018. It really seemed like people didn't care, or they didn't understand how big of a deal that was, that because I said Father's Day was for men, that I was being ridiculed. And, it was like people just didn't see that it was a big deal. So what I want people to not just know what it is, but also to realize it's a big deal and we have to push back on it. I'm seeing now that they want to take comments off of Lizzo's picture, for anybody that's saying something that hurt her feelings. And I think if you're a big fat whale and you post your picture on Facebook, you should, expect people to say, my gosh, you look like a big fat whale. I don't understand why that's so, wrong, but I want people to realize that it is a big deal that our speech is being censored and do something about it.
Well, I won't have time for my last question, but I do want to say it was about comedy.
No, you go for it, man. I've got a couple of minutes. Go for it.
Well, it's so funny. You talked about your comedy cancellation or this silly non-existent form because as a comedian, I know it must be hard. I want to ask you, is comedy dead? Not dead yet, but is it moving toward that direction? Because that was years ago when that happened to you 3-4 years ago. It's getting worse. I see you post jokes and it's just weird the way people respond. I don't care about people giving you a hard time. You post a joke and they respond with science and research but it was a joke. Why are you responding to his joke? Well, actually, in 1943, this is what happened. You need to read a book. It's a joke. So what do you think about the state of comedy?
It's a hard one because it really depends, right? Like people like, you can hear both sides of the argument. People like Ricky Gervais, for example, would say, well, look, you can do any comedy you want and people can respond any way you want, and that's fine. And for Ricky Gervais, that is absolutely true. For Bill Burr, that is absolutely true. For Joe Rogan, that is absolutely true. Mm-hmm. For Chris Rock, that is absolutely true. If you are a lower ranked comedian, if you're making your way through the comedy circuit, it's incredibly hard. It's incredibly competitive. And I'm not really doing much stand-up anymore at all. I've really thrown all my energy into working on the show, Trigonometry, and my book, and other things that I'm doing. But I can tell you, my experience of working on the circuit was a lot of comedians are self-censoring all the time because their future is not in their hands. If you are operating on the comedy circuit, you don't write your own checks. You don't have your own audience. You depend on a small number of comedy clubs. It's a tiny industry in the UK. It's a tiny industry in America, even though these are the two main places where live comedy is really a thing. Then you're operating in a very small world, which I thought when I went into comedy, I was like, well, this is the place for people who have a different opinion. The Bill Burrs, the Bill Hickses, the George Carlins, the Chris Rocks, the people who want to push against the narrative, who want to challenge the dogma, right? That's what I thought. Turns out the comedy industry is full of the most conformist, groupthink idiots that you could ever meet. They all think the same, and the moment they find out that you don't, they're going to come after you. They're going to try and get you not to perform at comedy shows where they perform, to get you cancelled. When we signed as Trigonometry with a big comedy agent in the UK, a bunch of these idiots tried to gang up and get our agent not to sign us, etc., etc. This is how these people operate. And so it really depends. Having said that, and I think this is an important counterweight to all of the concern about the future of comedy, great comedy has always been about pushing back against dogma, right? And so if the more dogma there is, the more reward there is for pushing against it. And so what I see down the line potentially is there will be more people who are willing to challenge those narratives. And I'm really actually expecting and very much looking forward to a new golden age of comedy, to a new age in which enough comedians just go, you know what, F you, I'm not buying into your crap. And by the way, the internet now allows me not to. I don't need the comedy club. I don't need to be on TV. I don't need this industry anymore. I can do my own thing, and I see people doing that. Ryan Long is a very good example of this, right? Mm-hmm. And there are others as well. So I think it's gonna go both ways. Mainstream comedy, I think, is dying, but the alternative comedy is potentially in its nascent form at the moment and will continue to grow, and I'm very hopeful about that.
I really hope you're right, because comedy, people underestimate the importance of comedy and all entertainment because it holds up a mirror to what's really happening in the world, and it's supposed to be able to be unfiltered. And I think that your earlier example is scary because 3 of those great comedians you mentioned are dead. So as the Chris Rocks and the others get older, if we don't replace them with other people who can speak, what happens in 10 years? So I hope you're right about what's coming up outside of the mainstream. I want to mention the podcast Trigonometry is phenomenal. They get phenomenal guests, and they do a great job in probing them and getting new stuff out of them, even though you hear them all the time. That's what's so wonderful about it. He is Konstantin Kisin. You can follow him on Twitter at Konstantin Kisin, and you can find the podcast at Trigger Pod. Konstantin, thank you for joining us on Cut the Bull. Shemeka, I'm sorry we lost Will, but this has been great and fun, and I appreciate your time.
I appreciate you guys having me on. Shemeka, Charles, and Will, thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you in the future.
Yes, and talk to you all next week.
Patriot J, I'm saving the day. Patriot J, I'm saving the day from you commies who let know you can't fuck with me. I got a country to say. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.